A merchant rounds a corner on a narrow road in feudal Japan and sees a samurai walking toward him. He doesn't make eye contact. He moves to the edge of the road and keeps his head low. His breathing slows. He doesn't speak. He doesn't gesture. He keeps walking, but carefully, measuring every step, every movement, every sound he makes. The samurai passes without a word. The merchant exhales, slowly, and keeps moving. Now here's the thing. Nothing happened in that moment. No confrontation, no threat, no raised voice. And yet the man was afraid, genuinely, physically afraid. Not because of what he thought the samurai might do, because of what he knew the samurai was allowed to do. That distinction matters more than almost anything else when you try to understand who samurai really were. Because the version most of us carry in our heads, the disciplined, honorable warrior, loyal to a code, graceful in combat, that version is real, but it's only part of the picture. The other part is much harder to look at. And that's exactly what this video is about. What actually made samurai terrifying, not in the movies, in real life. If you find yourself curious about the history behind this, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this one regularly, and there's a lot more where this came from. Let's start with something that most people don't know existed. There was a legal right in feudal Japan called Kiri-sute gomen. Loosely translated, it meant permission to cut and leave. It gave samurai the legal authority to draw their sword and strike, potentially kill, any person of a lower social class who they felt had compromised their honor. Read that again slowly. It was a legal right, written into the structure of the society. The rule was framed as a kind of self-defense. The strike had to follow the offense immediately. It couldn't be premeditated in a formal sense. But in practice, the interpretation of what counted as an offense was left almost entirely to the samurai. A wrong glance, a failure to bow, an accidental bump on the road. These weren't metaphors. These were real situations that ended in real deaths. And here's what made the whole thing even more one-sided. When a samurai acted on this right, he often had personal servants nearby who served as witnesses. Except those witnesses weren't neutral. A servant testifying against his own master would be putting himself at enormous risk. So in most cases, the samurai's version of events simply stood. There was no counterweight, no mechanism to push back. One documented case tells you everything. A commoner accidentally bumped into a samurai named Saiheiji Tomo and failed to apologize the way Tomo expected. The situation escalated. The commoner fled, and in doing so took Tomo's short sword with him, whether intentionally or not. Tomo pursued the matter. Not just the man, his entire family, every one of them was killed. And this happened within the bounds of the law. That's not a story about a violent individual making a terrible choice. That's a story about what the system permitted, what it protected. The terror wasn't random, it was built in. But to understand how a person could carry that kind of power, you have to go back to where samurai came from. Not geographically, developmentally. Because what made them so capable of violence wasn't just their weapons or their rank. It was what happened to them starting from the time they were children. Boys who were destined for the samurai class didn't have ordinary childhoods. The pleasures that most children take for granted, play, rest, softness, were largely removed from them early. Scholars who studied these communities noted how unusually serious samurai children appeared. Not serious in a forced or performative way, but in a settled, conditioned way, as though they had already absorbed something that most adults spend years trying to accept. Their training covered swordsmanship, archery, horsemanship, and swimming. They learned how to move, how to endure, how to remain composed under physical stress. And they were taught one more thing that most modern people find almost incomprehensible: how to end their own lives with their sword, if circumstances required it. This wasn't taught as a last resort in some vague, hypothetical sense. It was a specific skill, practiced and understood, and it was used. In 1868, during the Battle of Aizu, 19 young members of a group called the White Tiger Brigade climbed a hill called Mount Imori. They believed their castle had fallen, Rather than face capture, they drew their blades and took their own lives, every single one of them. They had been students, boys, and they died the way they had been trained to. The point of all this conditioning wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though it was undeniably brutal. The point was desensitization. A samurai who flinched, who hesitated, who felt the weight of death too heavily in the moment it mattered, was a samurai who might fail. So the training was designed to remove that hesitation, to make violence feel ordinary, to make death, even one's own, feel like something that could be faced without breaking down. That's not a quality you develop as an adult. It has to start much earlier, when the mind is still forming. And that's exactly what happened. Now the battlefield itself. Because training only matters when you see what it produced under real conditions. Japanese warfare wasn't always the composed, choreographed duel that later stories and paintings tend to suggest. Large battles were chaotic and close. The distance between two armies would collapse quickly, and what began as an exchange of arrows or gunfire often deteriorated into something much more immediate. Men fighting in very close quarters, with very little space between life and death. At the naval battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, the losing side, the Heike clan, wasn't merely defeated. They were wiped out. The scale of that killing was unlike anything Japan had seen at that point. This wasn't a battle where the losers surrendered and were taken prisoner. There was no mercy clause built into the outcome, but the battlefield itself isn't where the most unsettling behaviors appeared. It's what happened after the fighting stopped. After a battle, samurai collected the heads of those they had killed. This is documented across centuries of Japanese warfare, and it was entirely normalized within samurai culture. The heads weren't taken as a grim personal ritual or a private act. They were taken as proof, as currency, because the head was how a samurai got paid. The system worked like this. A warrior's reward, his land, his income, his status, was often determined by the number and rank of enemies he had killed. And the way you proved a kill was by presenting the head. Lords and officials would review these at what were called head-viewing ceremonies, where the trophies were formally assessed and ranked. The process was ritualized to a degree that feels almost impossible to reconcile with how grim the subject matter was. Heads were cleaned, hair was combed. Cosmetics were sometimes applied to make them look more presentable. They were mounted on boards with labels identifying who they had been. A woman named Oan, the daughter of a samurai, left behind a first-hand account of being inside Ogaku Castle during the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 and having to sleep alongside a collection of these severed heads. She described it plainly, not as something exceptional, as something that was simply the reality of that place and that time. What makes this worth sitting with is the economic logic underneath it. When killing is connected directly to payment, the incentive to kill becomes entangled with the incentive to survive. And that created problems. Some samurai, unwilling to return empty-handed or unable to claim a legitimate kill, found ways to game the system. Low-ranking soldiers were presented as important figures. Some samurai went further and killed common people from nearby villages to bring back heads that could be claimed as battlefield prizes. The situation became bad enough that certain commanders occasionally banned head collection during active fighting entirely. Not out of mercy, but because their men were too focused on gathering proof of kills to actually win the battle. That detail says something. When the reward system produces behavior that threatens military effectiveness, it means the incentive has become more powerful than the mission. The samurai class had built a structure that turned violence into a form of income, and that logic had consequences that even the people running the system couldn't always control. And then there's a practice that exists somewhat outside the battlefield entirely, something that happened in ordinary times, in ordinary places, and that reveals something about how far this culture's relationship with violence extended. When a sword was newly made, freshly forged, freshly sharpened, it needed to be tested. The practice of testing a blade was called tamshigiri, and at its most basic, it involved cutting through rolled straw to check the edge and weight of the weapon. That version was common and relatively unremarkable. But for samurai of higher rank, or for wealthy clients commissioning expensive blades, the test sometimes moved beyond straw. Condemned criminals were used. A person who had been sentenced to death could be brought in as a testing subject, and the sword would be drawn across them, across a living person, to assess whether the blade performed correctly. There's a certain logic to it, from within the worldview of the time. A sword made for war should be tested under conditions as close to war as possible. The person being used had already been condemned. But the effect of normalizing that kind of use of a human being is hard to overstate. It communicated something to everyone who knew it happened. It said that the gap between a person and a piece of testing material was, under certain conditions, crossable. This becomes even clearer with a practice called tsujigiri, which translates roughly to crossroads killing. At night, a samurai with a new weapon or a technique he wanted to test might go out into the streets and wait. The first person he encountered, a traveler, a craftsman walking home, anyone, could become the target. It was technically illegal. But here's why almost no one was ever prosecuted for it. The only witness was the person who died. There's no record of widespread panic about this practice, no large public outcry demanding enforcement. Because the social reality was that commoners already understood what their position meant. The law existed on paper. The power existed in practice. And those two things didn't always match. If you're finding this as quietly unsettling as I am, it might be worth hitting the like button. It genuinely helps this channel, and it tells us you want more content that goes beyond the surface version of history. Because that's really the thread running through everything we've covered so far. The sword testing, the head collection, the legal right to kill for a perceived slight. None of it was accidental. None of it was the result of individual warriors going rogue. This was a designed system. The pieces fit together. Think about what that system produced from the perspective of ordinary people living inside it. A farmer, a merchant, an artisan, someone whose entire world was their village, their trade, their family. That person understood that a samurai walking past them could, if sufficiently displeased, end their life on the spot. And the law would protect the samurai afterward, and the witnesses would not speak against him, and there was no body to appeal to that would provide justice. So what do you do with that knowledge? You internalize it. You adjust your entire way of moving through the world. You keep your eyes down. You make your body smaller. You make no sudden movements. You think carefully about every word before it leaves your mouth in the presence of someone armed and ranked above you. The fear wasn't just a side effect of the samurai class. It was a function. A society where the people at the bottom are perpetually uncertain about whether they might be killed today is a society where those people don't organize, don't resist, don't threaten the structure above them. The terror kept the hierarchy in place. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how power sustains itself when it's built on force rather than consent. And feudal Japan's version of that arrangement was particularly stark. The samurai didn't just hold power. They held it in a way that was visible, physical, and constantly reinforced by the possibility of sudden, legal violence. There's something worth pausing on here, though. Because the samurai did have a code. The ideals of loyalty, discipline, simplicity, and self-sacrifice were real. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a fiction invented later to make the class look better. Those values existed alongside everything else we've discussed. The same training that produced men capable of terrifying violence also produced men capable of profound self-discipline and loyalty that held through enormous pressure. But those two things were never in conflict within the system. The honor code didn't soften the violence. It directed it. A samurai who followed Bushido was still a person who could legally kill a commoner for showing insufficient deference. The code governed how you treated your lord, your peers, your equals. It didn't extend downward in the same way. This is what gets lost in the romanticized version. We tend to take the aesthetic, the elegant sword, the composed demeanor, the beautiful armor, and project a kind of moral completeness onto it. We assume that because samurai valued certain things deeply, those values protected everyone around them. But history doesn't support that reading. The people who lived under samurai rule weren't experiencing noble warriors from a distance. They were navigating a world where one wrong step, one accidental slight, one unlucky encounter on a dark road could end everything. Not because the samurai they met was necessarily cruel, but because the system gave him the option to be, and removed almost every consequence for exercising it. What's interesting is that this reality shaped Japanese culture in ways that lasted long after the samurai class itself was dissolved. The deep emphasis on social deference, on reading a room carefully, on never causing the person above you to lose face. These aren't abstract values. They have roots in centuries of living under conditions where getting it wrong carried genuine physical consequences. Cultures are shaped by what their people had to survive, and what ordinary Japanese people had to survive for centuries included the constant, quiet presence of armed men whose authority over them was nearly total. The samurai disappeared as a formal class in the late 19th century, but the social architecture they inhabited and helped build had already done its work. So when we come back to the central question, what actually made samurai terrifying, the answer isn't the sword. It isn't the training, though that was extraordinary. It isn't even the specific practices, as disturbing as they are. It's the system. The way legal authority, economic incentive, childhood conditioning, and social hierarchy were woven together into something that functioned as a complete machine. Each part reinforced the others. The law gave samurai the right to kill. The training gave them the capacity and the composure to do it without hesitation. The head-based reward system gave them a material reason to do it well, and the social structure ensured that no one below them had any meaningful recourse when it happened. Remove any one of those pieces and the whole thing changes, but with all of them in place, what you have is a class of people for whom violence was legal, economically rewarded, physically practiced from childhood, and socially protected afterward. That's not terrifying because it's foreign. It's terrifying because it's coherent, because you can follow the logic of it, and that coherence is what's worth sitting with. We tend to prefer the version of the samurai that fits neatly into a story about honor, because that version is genuinely compelling. There's something real in the image of a warrior who values loyalty over comfort, who accepts death calmly, who moves through life with discipline and intention. Those qualities existed. They mattered. But they existed inside a structure that most of the people living under it would not have called noble. They would have called it frightening. And they would have been right. If this video gave you something to think about, drop a comment below. I'd genuinely like to know which part of this hit differently than you expected. And if you want to keep exploring the history behind the myths we inherit, there's plenty more here waiting for you. The real question, maybe, is this: when we admire the samurai, when we find them compelling, when we put them in films and games and art, what exactly are we admiring? The discipline? The aesthetic? The philosophy? Or are we, without realizing it, drawn to something darker? The certainty, the power, the idea of a world where some people were simply above the rules that governed everyone else. That's worth thinking about, honestly.